Well, hello there. Thank you so much for joining me again for yet another true crime video. If you've never seen me before, hi, my name is Rachel, and this is a true crime channel. If you like true crime and true crime adjacent stuff, dark history, etc., you will probably like it here. So today's true crime story is a little bit heavier than some of the ones we've covered before. So instead of rolling my standard sort of disclaimer, may not be appropriate for all audiences, etc., I'm giving you a custom-made warning that this case is pretty bad and it does involve a underage person, not a small child or anything, just a teenager, but somebody who is a minor. If that is going to cause you some trouble, please take care of yourself. Go ahead and click away. You can join me another time. There are some very serious elements to this case, and I would not recommend that you listen to it on speakers at work. Okay, send the kiddies to bed for this one because it's going to get a little dark. Obviously, as always, I'm not going to be unnecessarily graphic or gratuitous, but just to tell you what happened here, I have to give some details that are, what am I trying to say here? It's a little more than usual. Let's just go ahead and get into it. Also, I'll be wearing my real glasses for reasons. So if you get a little bit of a glare from the lights, I'm terribly sorry. So this case takes place in my home state, not terribly far from where I currently live, and it still is considered one of the, if not the, worst murder ever in the state of Indiana. So on October 26th, 1965, the Indianapolis police entered 3852 East New York Street in Indianapolis, Indiana. They had no idea of the gruesome scene that they were about to find. On a filthy mattress laid the body of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. She was visibly malnourished, gaunt, and emaciated. She was covered from head to toe in sores and bruises and burns. All of them were in various stages of healing, and it did not take an expert to be able to see that. And most prominently, burned into her torso were the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." It was abundantly clear to everyone there that Sylvia had been slowly and painfully tortured to death. The occupants of the home were 37-year-old Gertrude Baniszewski and her 7 children. And Gertrude explained to the police that Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny, who was 15 at the time, were boarders in her home. Her parents were paying Gertrude to provide room and board for them for a period of time. She also told the police that from day one of Sylvia coming into her home, she had been a problem. She was running around, sleeping with married men. She had managed to get herself pregnant. And not only was she sleeping with these married men, but she was taking money in exchange for that. And the final straw, she ran off with a group of boys into the woods to do God knows what, and had returned to them in that condition. They were the ones who had beat her so badly. The mother of 7 also provided police with a written statement that seemed to be in Sylvia's handwriting, or at least Gertrude claimed it was in Sylvia's handwriting, that basically just backed up everything that she said. But as the police carried Sylvia's body out of the house, 15-year-old Jenny got one of them alone long enough to whisper, "Get me out of here, and I will tell you everything." So Sylvia Likens was born January 3rd, 1949 to Lester and Elizabeth Likens. She was the third of 5 children total. Both of her siblings on either side of her, so her older and her younger siblings, were fraternal twins. There was Daniel and Diana, who were 2 years older than she was, and Benny and Jenny, who were 1 year younger. And Lester and Elizabeth, although they did seem to love their children, struggled to kind of provide a stable household for them. They were always traveling around for work. They worked as carnies pretty frequently, traveling mostly around Indiana and neighboring states in the summertime. It seems like they often sold things like as vendors, popcorn, cotton candy, hot dogs, etc. And then in the off season, Lester would usually just kind of work odd jobs or whatever he could find. But there was no real consistent, stable income coming into the household. They didn't even really have a household. They moved around constantly. But despite the generally transient nature of the family, they did have kind of a home base in Indianapolis. Sylvia's grandparents had a home there, and Sylvia and her siblings would often stay with them while the parents were traveling, or at least the female children would sometimes stay there while the parents took the male children to work. They didn't always feel like it was a safe environment at the carnivals and stuff for the younger girls, I guess. So sometimes they would leave them behind just to like keep going to school, etc. So they kind of considered Indianapolis to be like their hometown, even though they were kind of from everywhere. And because work was so inconsistent and so dependent on the season, dependent on what the parents could get, etc., the family was always living in poverty. But even though that was true, like so many other kids who grow up in sort of tumultuous but loving households, Sylvia seemed to be doing just fine. She was friendly and confident. She was kind of considered brave. She would often come to the defense of Jenny, who was a lot more meek than she was, and also walked with a pronounced limp because she had leg braces that she had to wear because she overcame polio when she was a baby. Unfortunately, it left her permanently damaged in both of her legs. So kids can be cruel, and people made fun of her, and Sylvia was always there to defend her. She apparently loved music, and like most teen girls in the 60s, her favorite band was the Beatles. Unfortunately, like I said before, their family life was always just kind of up and down. Besides the fact that they were moving all the time, and besides the fact that there was rarely enough money to go around, Lester and Elizabeth were sort of constantly separating and reconciling all the time. So pretty frequently, one of the parents would be out of the picture for some period of time. The situation with the family as we come into summer of 1965 is that Lester was sort of missing in action. He wasn't around. They were kind of separated at the time. And Elizabeth was left in Indianapolis with all 5 of the kids, trying to take care of them on a one-person income, doing whatever she could do. Unfortunately, what she could do was shoplift to help provide for them, and she was caught doing that and locked in the county jail for a time. And when she got locked up because Lester wasn't around, the kids were more or less left on their own, which sounds kind of horrendous to us now, but remember that Daniel and Diana were 18 years old, 17 or 18 years old. And Sylvia was 16, and it was just a different time. I don't think that people would have thought that a 18, 17, 16, 15-year-old wouldn't be able to take care of themselves. I think that although it might be kind of an odd situation, most people would assume that by the time someone's 18 years old, they can be out on their own. And in fact, Diana was out on her own. She had gotten married and was living with her husband. So she would have been available to check in on the children. And of course, they had their grandparents nearby. Now, Sylvia and Jenny did have some friends in the neighborhood. They had befriended a pair of sisters, Paula and Stephanie Banazuski. They had just met at school. And during the time that they were essentially without guardianship, the Likens girls spent a lot of time at the Banazuskis. It was just on the same block as their house, and the matriarch of the house, Gertrude, or Gertie, as she liked to be called, sort of allowed the home to be like a little local hang spot for the teens. And of course, with 7 kids, they always had friends coming in and out. So it was kind of a busy place. And Gertie didn't seem to mind who was there or how long they stayed. Lester did eventually return to Indianapolis that summer and found that his wife was locked up in jail and his kids were essentially nowhere to be found. But he was able to ask around and he found them at Gertrude's. They were just hanging out, being teenagers, seemed completely perfectly happy and satisfied to be hanging out with some friends. Lester and Betty, that's Elizabeth, by the way. Betty is short for Elizabeth, if you didn't know that. Lester and Betty had already been talking while she was locked up. She was about to get out. And they decided that they were going to get back on the carnival circuit. I think that they were going to the East Coast this time. So it was going to be a much further and longer trip. But they were going to go and do that for as long as they possibly could because that was the best and most consistent money that they could make. Now, normally when they would go on the road like this, they would leave the kids with their grandparents. But this time, Lester figured maybe the girls would be happier staying with their friends, a whole house full of other young people, teenagers. That's a lot more fun than staying with your old grandparents. I mean, I know that I probably would have liked to hang out with my friends for months on end instead of being at my grandparents' house. It seems pretty reasonable. They seemed happy there. He had no reason to think that they wouldn't be. So he stopped by Gertie's place and he made an arrangement with her that he would pay her $20 a week for room and board for both of his girls. And she very happily agreed to this arrangement, telling him, I'll treat them like they're my own children. If you're leaving your kids with somebody and they tell you I will treat them like my own children, you should probably have a good understanding of exactly how it is they treat their own children. Because Gertrude Baniszewski was not exactly a fit mother. So firstly, she already had 7 kids from ages 17 down to 7 months. Now that's a lot of kids, especially considering that Gertie was a chronically ill asthmatic, a situation that was not helped at all by her constant chain smoking. She did not work at all outside of the home. She relied mostly on sporadic and infrequent child support payments from the father of her oldest 6 children. The father of her youngest child didn't pay anything at all. He was completely missing in action. Sometimes she would take in like ironing from some of the neighbors to make a little extra money, but because she was so ill all the time, it made doing anything involving labor really difficult for her. I mentioned that the baby of the family had a different father than the rest of the kids. This was a 22-year-old man named Dennis Wright. He was about 12 years Gertie's junior. And he had stuck around basically not at all after the baby was born. Like he was out of there before the cord was cut, never to be heard from again. Now, she and Mr. Wright were never married, despite the fact that she occasionally told people her name was Mrs. Wright or Gertrude Wright to sort of pass off the idea that perhaps she had been married to him, because at the time, right, we're talking about 1965, it was very severely frowned upon to have a child out of wedlock. And Gertrude really liked to try to keep up appearances in public. Both her relationship with her husband and her relationship with Dennis Wright were violent, abusive. Gertie was severely depressed all of the time. And due to the asthma and the depression and all of this stuff, she had gotten herself quite a habit with prescription pills. And again, it's the 60s, so they were handing out the good stuff back then. Lester didn't really look real hard around the place before he left his children in Gertrude's care. But if he had, he might have noticed that the cupboards were essentially bare. There was never enough food in the house because there was never enough money. There weren't even an appropriate number of beds for the number of children living in the home. And the place was filthy. I mean, again, she's a chain smoker, so I'm sure everything was covered in that, like, you know, that film of tar that smokers' houses get. And again, she's the only adult in the house. I don't know if you've ever had teenagers living with you, but they don't clean. And other than the living room, there was just barely any furniture at all. This was a dysfunctional and often violent household with a family living in abject poverty. I don't know if you watch Shameless, but like in my mind, I picture them as like a not funny version of the Gallaghers, just kind of ragtag children running around constantly unsupervised, trying to make ends meet in any way that they can with no help from a parental figure. Because Gertie really wasn't much of a parent, other than when she was like beating her children for misbehaving. She pretty much didn't want to be a 37-year-old mom of 7. She apparently often flirted with some of the teenage boys in the neighborhood that she would have over to the house. She would dance for them or with them. Either way, it's some creepy vibes. And she just generally was not a good mom. But she did very much try to keep up appearances around the neighborhood. She and the kids attended church every Sunday, and the kids did attend school on a regular basis. And like I said, she really bent over backwards to try to cover up the fact that she had a baby with a man she was not married to. Plus, they lived in a generally impoverished area of the city anyway, so they may not have really stuck out that much as particularly unusual. So Lester and Betty take off. They leave Jenny and Sylvia behind at the Baniszewski home. Betty never went inside the house at all, and Lester never went beyond the living room. Not even when he came back to visit several times during the months they were gone. In hindsight, this was a terrible idea, but at the time, Lester saw that his 16 and 15-year-old daughters seemed comfortable and happy in that house. They didn't tell him that there was anything amiss, and so he had no real reason to worry, he thought. And truly, everything was going just fine for the Likens girls. They went to school and to church with the Baniszewskis. Everything seemed like it was going pretty well for like 2 weeks tops. See, Gertie's oldest daughter, 17-year-old Paula, had recently admitted to her mother that she was pregnant, and the father was a significantly older and married man. For Gertrude, this was devastating news, right? Baby out of wedlock, big problem. She's been trying to cover up her own indiscretion. Fortunately, she was able to lie and say that Dennis had gone off and joined the military or whatever because he just took off. In this case, the father is married, so they can't even save Paula's reputation with a hasty shotgun wedding. And then amid all of this turmoil, Lester's $20 payment that he had agreed to send was late. It didn't show up on the day that it was expected. And whatever thread was holding what was left of Gertrude's sanity in place finally snapped. She came after Jenny first. She slapped her in the face and yelled at the girls, "I took care of you two bitches for 2 weeks for nothing." She then proceeded to beat them on their bare backside with a thick leather belt left behind by her ex-husband John Baniszewski, an Indianapolis police officer. After this incident, Gertie seemed to put all of her focus and energy on Sylvia, using her as a personal outlet for all her frustrations and anguish. Paula Baniszewski had also seemed to develop a particular dislike for Sylvia, going so far as to tell her mother lies about the girl in order to get Sylvia worse punishments. Because she was so frail and sickly, Gertrude would sometimes have Paula dole out the beatings for her instead. One day, Sylvia came home with some money that she had gotten by collecting old Coke bottles from around the neighborhood, which she then turned in to get a little bit of cash. Gertrude immediately accused her of stealing that money and burned her fingertips off with a match. Gertie also began to project onto Sylvia all the frustrations that she actually had with her own daughter, Paula. She would accuse Sylvia of being pregnant, accuse her of sleeping with married men, which is of course, exactly what her own child was doing. And all of this abuse got so much worse when Paula and her sister Stephanie concocted this story about how Sylvia was spreading rumors about them at school. Supposedly, they were telling kids that they had seen Paula and Stephanie go with some boys and take money for sleeping with them, basically calling them sex workers, right? Now, this story was almost certainly untrue, but that did not stop Gertrude from believing it. It just seems that Gertie and Paula were the main perpetrators of violence against their young boarder, and most people think that a huge portion of that is because of simple jealousy. Sylvia was very young, very beautiful. She had her whole life ahead of her. Paula had effectively ruined her life with an unwanted pregnancy. At the time, that was a big deal. Having a child out of wedlock at that time could have made it more difficult for you to get a job, more difficult for you to get married. Sylvia didn't have that burden. And Gertrude was 3 years shy of 40. But because of her chronic illness and her general lifestyle, she was aging a lot faster. She was a 2-time divorcee, I forgot to mention, between the ex-husband John Baniszewski and the relationship with Dennis Wright. She also got married to a man named Edward, but they were literally only married for a few weeks. So she was a 2-time divorcee. She had an illegitimate child whose father had abandoned them, and 6 other kids who sucked up every little resource she had. Sylvia represented everything she wished she had, but never could. Freedom, youth, beauty, a chance at a happy life. Gertrude was not much older than Sylvia when she had begun her first marriage, which was turbulent and abusive. And all that anger, all that rage, all that disappointment was expelled as physical violence onto Sylvia Likens. And it wasn't long before Gertie was encouraging even the younger children to take part in these beatings. This included her 12-year-old son, John, 11-year-old Marie, and 10-year-old Shirley. She also had a younger son named James. He was only 8 years old at the time, and it's not known whether he was made to participate in the torture. And then, of course, Dennis was just a baby. But Gertie and her children treated Sylvia like a punching bag. They hit her with fists. They kicked her. They would use Gertie's old police belt or a wooden paddle that she had, like the old-fashioned fraternity style paddles. And they all seemed really fond of pushing her down the stairs. Gertrude was also very forthcoming with the verbal assaults, yelling at her and cursing at Sylvia constantly, often accusing her of stealing or being a sex worker. On top of the actual physical violence, they would also withhold food from Sylvia, or they would feed her something disgusting and inedible, or force her to eat out of the trash. And eventually, it wasn't just the family getting in on this horrific treatment. Stephanie's boyfriend, a boy named Coy Hubbard, who is also 15 years old, heard about this rumor that Sylvia was supposedly spreading about Stephanie, and so he came over and had his vengeance on her. Coy actually did judo, and he would come over and basically use Sylvia as an unwilling practice participant, and not like in a gentle, friendly way. He would full on pick her up and slam her to the ground. He would kick and punch her in the face. And like all the others, seemed to have an affinity for pushing her down the stairs. Now, you remember I told you that Gertrude's house was sort of a hangout for the local kids. Well, one of these kids was Gertie's neighbor, Richard, or Ricky Hobbs. He was only 14 at the time, and he was always just kind of hanging out. He seemed to be more Gertrude's friend than any of the kids' friends, and some people actually think that they may have had an unnatural relationship going on. I would call it maybe a grooming situation. It's not really known for sure. It's just speculated. I've seen a couple of places that referred to them as possibly lovers, and I don't like that categorization because I want to make it very, very clear that when we're talking about a 14-year-old boy and a 37-year-old woman, there's no consent happening, right? They're not having an affair, okay? She's assaulting him, perhaps, but again, that's not really known. And since Ricky was always around, it seems likely that he participated in the normal hitting, kicking, punching, etc. But the incident that he is most well known for is one that occurred shortly before Sylvia's death. He is the one who, under Gertrude's instruction, branded Sylvia with a hot needle across her chest and torso with that phrase that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video and that I don't care to repeat here. As he branded her, while Gertrude and at least one of the other children held Sylvia down, he also punched her periodically when she would flinch from the pain. For a while, Sylvia was still going to school and attending church, but eventually she was confined to the house. Her condition had gotten so bad that Gertrude knew anyone who saw her would have some questions, and so she was forced to stay inside. Her days mostly consisted of laying around on a bare mattress in a mostly empty room, bleeding and sometimes nearly incapacitated. That is until one day, on a day when Gertrude was particularly unhinged. She pulled Sylvia out into the living room and forced her to strip down naked in front of some of the other kids, some of the neighborhood boys. Coy Hubbard and Ricky Hobbs were definitely there. Once the girl was nude, Gertrude forced her to do some kind of a striptease dance, and then also forced her to do something with a glass Coke bottle. And I am not going to say what it is. I will just let you extrapolate that information. But this event left her incontinent, and as such, she would wet the bed. This, of course, infuriated Gertrude. She didn't seem to be able to make the connection that she had caused the problem. But after that, Sylvia was confined to the basement, and she was often chained there, standing upright and naked. The basement had no cooling, no heat, no bathroom, and they usually didn't bring her any food. The kids, even the younger ones, started inviting their friends over, charging them each a nickel to gawk at their captive, or to take their turn kicking, hitting, or burning her with cigarette butts. Before we got to this point, with Sylvia chained up, starving in the basement of this house, there had been multiple opportunities to help her, but she was failed time and time again. First of all, let's start with every single adult that Sylvia interacted with from the first time Gertrude lit into her until she was confined to the house. She had visible bruising, visible burns, and wounds. She was clearly underweight. No one said anything. Then there's their older sister, Diana. Remember, she was married, she was living on her own. Sylvia and Jenny told her about the abuse, but she thought they were just unhappy about being punished and were just trying to come and live with her where they would maybe have less rules. And so she also did nothing. The girls' grandparents lived close by. Their brothers were actually staying with their grandparents, but they never came to check on them. Their father did actually come by a couple of times just to say hey, see how they were, but he never went beyond the living room. And also, when Gertrude told him that Sylvia wasn't there, he didn't pry. He never insisted on actually physically seeing both of his girls and making sure they were okay. The next door neighbors, a couple named Phyllis and Raymond Vermillion, saw Paula throw steaming hot water on Sylvia at some backyard barbecue thing. Paula also admitted to Phyllis that she had been beating Sylvia. They saw the girl with a black eye on one occasion, a black eye and a busted lip on another. And one day, when Phyllis had stopped by the Baniszewski home, she observed Paula beating Sylvia with that leather police belt. Guess who didn't go to the authorities? Guess who didn't say anything? Phyllis and Raymond. Judy Duke was a 12-year-old girl who had happened to get an invitation to the Baniszewski's home to look at Sylvia like so many others had. And she actually went home and told her mother that they were starving and beating Sylvia. Her mother told her, well, that's what happens when you get punished. And nothing else was said. Maybe like so many others, Judy's mom had heard and believed the vicious rumors that Gertrude had been spreading around about Sylvia, categorizing her as a thief, a problem child, telling anyone who would listen that she was disobedient and promiscuous. It's likely that given all of this, a lot of people truly thought that Sylvia was getting a punishment and that she deserved it. At some point, Diana, remember the older sister, she did come by the house, but was refused entry. Gertrude actually told her that their parents had told her not to let Diana come in. Diana thought that this was incredibly suspicious, so she waited outside until Jenny came out and then tried to talk to her. And Jenny just freaked out and said, "I'm not allowed to talk to you," and ran away from her. This really worried Diana. Finally, somebody's worried about these girls. And so she did contact social services, such that it was in 1965. Social services sent somebody over, and when she got there and asked if she could see Sylvia, she was told that Sylvia had run away. And of course, she talked to Jenny right in front of Gertrude, and Jenny confirmed that Sylvia had indeed run away. Of course she did, because she was scared to death of Gertrude, but whatever. After that, the social worker closed the case. Nobody needed to go to the Baniszewski home to check it out anymore. And by the way, they didn't report the runaway. You would think a 16-year-old runs away from home and somebody's going to go looking for her. But no, they were just like, oh, she ran away? Okay, no problem, and moved on. Some of the reason that Sylvia wasn't helped isn't necessarily because people were just heartless. I think it has a lot to do with the time. Nobody talked about domestic violence in the 1960s. Children were routinely beaten with paddles and belts. Most of the time, you could beat a kid with a paddle at school. This was just how you disciplined children in the eyes of most people. And if it went beyond simple discipline, most people just minded their own business. What you did with your children, with your wife, in your house, was your business. People did not insert themselves. The time of children being precious cargo, who needed gentle guidance and understanding, had not yet come, especially for most poor and working class families at this time. Worrying about meeting the emotional needs of your children when you are busting your ass every day just to feed them, not on the radar. Quiet obedience was the expectation for most children, or better yet, they could just stay out of the way. These are the days when mothers kicked their children out of the house to go play outside, unsupervised, until the streetlights came on and fathers came home from work expecting dinner to be on the table. It was also expected that fathers kept the order of their home with a firm word and a leather belt. Ideas about this kind of child rearing were changing a little bit, especially maybe in some of the bigger cities on the West Coast, but not in the working class homes of Middle America. I can tell you, because I live here. I am 34 years old. I have friends who regularly got spanked with a belt. So I'm telling you, if Gertie's neighbors just kind of thought that she was getting punishment, they would have had no reason to say anything. It's not that surprising that nobody came to the rescue. And so even though when they were seeing Sylvia at school and at church, she didn't probably look like she was doing too well, nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to get involved until it was too late. And if you don't mind following me on a tiny little tangent here, if you see something, say something. Never ever assume that someone else is going to do it or someone else has already done it. Familiarize yourself with the signs of child endangerment. Pick up the phone, call the police, call your local Department of Child Safety, because this kind of thing still goes on. In Harris County, Texas, literally just a few weeks ago, they found 3 young boys living in an apartment completely alone with no running water, no electricity, with the dead body of their younger brother. And they had been there literally for months. And the worst part is the neighbors knew. The neighbors had seen the older boy out. Some of them were even giving him food. Every single one of them said they knew something wasn't right. They were very concerned about the boy. They could tell he wasn't being fed. They could tell his parents weren't around. Not a single one of them picked up the phone and called. Even though they knew. Please don't be those people. Don't be the people sitting around regretting that you didn't do something or that you thought maybe somebody else would take care of it instead. Those boys could have been helped much earlier. Sylvia and Jenny could have been helped much earlier. If you see something, say something. Okay, that's it. I'm off my soapbox now. We're moving on. So by October of 1965, Sylvia is chained in the basement of 3852 East New York Street. Rail thin. She's still receiving daily torment from her captors. She is covered in sores and burns. She has no blankets, no bedding, no toilet, no clothing. Gertrude had stopped feeding her, and when it was becoming very clear that she was fading, Gertrude hatched a plan. She brought Sylvia up from the basement. She gave her a pen and paper and then dictated to her what she wanted her to write. This would be the note that Gertrude Baniszewski would give to the police when they eventually found Sylvia's body. This was her big insurance policy. She had Sylvia address the letter to Mr. and Mrs. Likens, which is a big red flag, because if it was actually something Sylvia was writing, she would have addressed it to Mom and Dad, right? Furthermore, the note, as dictated by Gertrude, says that Sylvia went with a gang of boys into the woods and they beat her up. That is a one-time event. This poor girl had bruises, sores, and burns on her that had been healing for months. Fresh ones and old ones. It was very clear that this was not a one-time incident. Gertrude's ultimate plan was to have Sylvia write this note and then take the girl, barely alive, and dump her off in the woods to die of exposure. I have some questions about this. What was the note for if she was going to dump her out in the woods and let her die? If Sylvia expired in the woods, how could she have come back and written the note and left it with Gertie? It doesn't make any sense. This woman is a wackadoodle. She has completely lost it, obviously. So while Gertrude was talking about this plan with her other children, Sylvia overheard her, and in a last-ditch effort to try to save her own life, she tried to get to the front door to escape. Unfortunately, her condition was so deteriorated and she was so weak that even frail and sick Gertrude was able to easily catch up to her and grab her and pull her back into the house. Once Gertie once again had Sylvia under her control, she did the thing that seemed to be her most favorite thing ever, which is to push her down the basement stairs. And this time she followed behind her and hit her with a curtain rod until she was unconscious. Sometime the next day, or possibly the day after, Gertrude sent a couple of her kids down to retrieve Sylvia and bring her upstairs for a bath. This was a ritual she had performed on this girl many times before, where she would draw a scalding hot bath and then dunk Sylvia into it with her hands and feet bound, ostensibly to cleanse the girl of her sins. But this time, when they attempted to lift Sylvia they found that she was not breathing. They, of course, called for Gertie, who came down and was absolutely unable to accept the truth. She screamed at Sylvia's lifeless body, "Get up, you faker! Get up, faker!" She screamed at the other kids that Sylvia was just trying to trick them in order to avoid having more punishment. Stephanie Baniszewski attempted to give Sylvia mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but unfortunately, it was already too late. Sylvia Likens, at just 16 years old, was gone from this earth, and Gertrude eventually had to face reality, realizing that her plan to dump Sylvia in the woods somewhere far from the home where she would not be culpable, those plans were out the window. I don't know if Gertrude didn't realize the link between physical violence, starvation, and death, but she panicked and she asked Ricky Hobbs, who was always around for some reason, to go down the street to the payphone to call the police. He couldn't call from the house because the house didn't have a working phone. And also, why are all these kids hanging out at Baniszewski's house all the time? Where are their parents? Around 6:30 p.m., the police arrived and discovered Sylvia's body. They were given the highly suspicious note by Gertie, and of course this is when Jenny was finally able to tell the police what had really been going on in that house since June. No one really knows exactly why Jenny was spared the fate of her older sister, but most people think that it is because she was permanently disabled from polio. She wore leg braces, she walked with a limp, and therefore she didn't seem like a threat to Paula and Gertrude. They simply didn't have the jealousy for her that they had for Sylvia. I think it's also possible that they might have felt sorry for her and that they viewed her as more vulnerable than the outspoken and tenacious Sylvia. Once Jenny got to tell her story, everyone in that house over the age of 10 was put under arrest. So Gertrude and Paula were going to be tried together, but Stephanie, the second oldest, was going to get her own separate trial. She was charged with second-degree murder, but she ended up turning state's witness, and all of the charges were dropped in exchange for her testifying against her family. John, who was only 12 at the time, was convicted of manslaughter, and he served 2 years at the Indiana State Reformatory. He's also the only one in the family who seemed to show any kind of real, genuine remorse. He ended up becoming very religious, and he did eventually marry and have 3 kids of his own. Marie, the 11-year-old, did testify at the trial of her mother and sister, but she was never charged with anything. Shirley, whose main contribution seems to be that she heated the needle that Hobbs would use to brand Sylvia, was also not charged. Coy Hubbard, the 15-year-old boyfriend of Stephanie, was convicted of manslaughter for his part in the torture. Ricky Hobbs, who was 15 at the time of conviction, was also convicted of manslaughter. They both got a sentence of 2 to 20 years, of which they both only served 2 years. In May of 1966, Gertrude and Paula Baniszewski would finally stand trial for the brutal, torturing murder of Sylvia Likens. Predictably, Gertrude claims that she didn't remember anything, and her lawyers tried to get her off on an insanity plea. Paula's only real defense was that she was acting on the request of her mother, which was really only partially true. She had her own vendetta against Sylvia. She took part in her own torture separate from what Gertrude was telling her to do. They actually had to delay this trial because I don't know if you remember from the very beginning of the story, but Paula was pregnant. So they had to delay the trial so that she could have her baby. She had a baby girl, and she named her Gertrude after her mom because she's such a great mom. Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. But she would not spend life in prison because they let her out on parole in 1985. Apparently, she was a model prisoner, and all the other inmates called her mom. It's so ironic. Literally makes me sick. Paula ended up being convicted of second-degree murder, but that conviction was overturned in 1971 over some kind of technicality. Rather than deal with going through a whole retrial, they pled Paula out on 2 to 21 years. They're really with the short sentences, but get this, she didn't even do the 2 to 21. They paroled her the next year in 1972. She ended up moving to Iowa. She got married. She had a couple more kids. She actually ended up getting a job with the school system in a little town called Conrad, and she was using the name Paula Pace. And she worked there until 2012, when somehow her real identity as a child killer became known to the school system. So, yeah, fired from that job. Oh, and Gertrude's lifetime of heavy chain smoking finally caught up with her. 5 years after she was released from prison in 1990, she died of lung cancer. And Ricky Hobbs, the kid who branded Sylvia, he ended up having some kind of mental breakdown, either while he was in prison or just after he was released after his whole 2 years sentence. He also picked up a habit of chain smoking and died of lung cancer at just 21 years old. And I'm not saying that they deserved it, but I am saying that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that is all I have for you today on the torture death of Sylvia Likens. I hope you found this interesting and enlightening, and I'm serious. Look for signs. Don't be that person who doesn't call. These girls could have both been helped, I think about it all the time. What would I do in a situation like that? I hope that I'm the kind of person who would call, you know what I mean? Anyway, it's so sad. The house has now been torn down. It was for sale just a few years ago, but it's completely torn down now. It's just an empty lot. And good riddance is what I say. Other than that, take care of yourself today and every single day. I think I'm going to go have a nice hot shower. I've been super sick and I feel like I deserve it. You go do something nice for yourself as well. And I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.